3:17 p.m. It appears in a battered radio log kept by a signals corporal who would later admit he barely remembered writing it. By April 1945, memory had become unreliable. Sleep came in fragments. Time blurred under artillery shock and exhaustion. Still, the log survives, and the entry is clear enough to read even now. A routine acknowledgement from a German officer confirming receipt of a fragmented withdrawal order. No urgency in the wording. No hint that it would be the final trace of him ever recorded. By that point in the war, Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Entire command structures were unraveling across the continent. Divisions that once moved with precision now drifted backward in pieces, guided more by instinct than strategy. Orders arrived late, contradicted one another, or referred to units that no longer existed. Officers were trained to believe in hierarchy, but hierarchy had begun to collapse under the weight of reality. The officer at the center of this story had not been a famous name. He was not part of the inner circle, not a public figure, not someone history expected to remember. He was a mid-ranking field officer assigned to oversee a logistical corridor near a wooded mountainous region that had become a bottleneck during the retreat. His role mattered because he controlled movement, supplies, wounded transport, fallback positions. In theory, he was supposed to be among the last to leave. Those who served under him later described him as controlled, quiet, rigid about procedure even when procedure no longer made sense. He insisted on proper documentation, on accurate headcounts, on logging equipment losses that everyone knew would never be recovered. It was not denial, it was discipline. For some officers, structure was the only thing keeping panic at bay. The days leading up to April were marked by constant pressure. Allied forces advanced faster than expected. Roads were clogged with civilian refugees moving in the opposite direction. Luftwaffe support had all but vanished. Fuel shortages forced units to abandon vehicles and proceed on foot. Entire companies dissolved overnight, absorbed into others or simply gone. Communication was unreliable. Radios worked when they wanted to. Lines were cut, repaired, cut again. Orders filtered down incomplete. One directive instructed a fallback to a location already overrun. Another contradicted it entirely. Officers were left making decisions that would once have required approval from multiple levels of command. At 3:02 p.m., a transmission came through ordering a partial withdrawal. At 3:09 p.m., another followed, unclear and partially garbled, suggesting a hold until further instruction. At 3:17 p.m., the officer acknowledged receipt and stated he would reposition his remaining men to a temporary command point near the forest edge. That was it. No distress call followed, no report of contact with the enemy, no mention of casualties. The radio operator waited for further instructions, but the channel went silent. By 4 p.m., the frequency was overwhelmed by overlapping calls from other units, many of them frantic. By nightfall, the front had shifted again. When roll was called that evening, confusion set in almost immediately. His name was read once. No answer. Read again. Still nothing. At first, no one reacted. Men were missing everywhere. Some had been sent on errands. Others were escorting wounded. A few were presumed dead without confirmation. But as the hours passed, it became clear this was different. His adjutant insisted he had not been reassigned. The medical officer confirmed he had not been brought in wounded. The rear command post reported no record of capture. When prisoners were processed over the next several days, his name did not appear on any Allied intake lists. No body was recovered. No eyewitness could place him in combat after mid-afternoon. He had simply vanished. In the chaos of 1945, that should not have stood out. Tens of thousands disappeared in those final weeks, but most left something behind: a rifle, a helmet, a bloodstain, a witness. This officer left nothing. His field desk was found intact. His sidearm remained holstered where he had last set it down. His maps were still folded, weighted by a paperweight made from a spent shell casing. Early assumptions formed quickly. Perhaps he deserted. It was not unheard of, especially among officers who saw no future in surrender. But desertion required movement, and no one reported seeing him leave the area. Roads were watched. Paths were crowded. An officer in uniform could not simply slip away unnoticed. Another theory suggested capture, but Allied records were meticulous when it came to officers, especially those of rank. Interrogations were logged. Names were cataloged. Decades later, historians would confirm the absence. No Allied file ever listed him as a prisoner. Some suggested he had been killed and buried hastily, lost among the countless unmarked graves. But the area around the command point was searched after the fighting moved on. Graves were found. His was not among them. No personal effects bearing his identification surfaced. Within days, his disappearance was reported up the chain, though by then the chain was barely functioning. The report was acknowledged, filed, and delayed. By the time it reached an office with the authority to investigate, the war was effectively over. Germany surrendered in May. Records were seized, destroyed, or scattered. Officers who might have known something were dead, imprisoned, or trying to survive in a ruined country. The disappearance became a footnote, then an anomaly, then a line in a ledger marked unresolved. For his family, the silence was worse than confirmation of death. They received no telegram, no official notice. Weeks turned into months. Eventually, a letter arrived stating only that he was missing in action as of April 1945, presumed dead. No location, no circumstances, no remains. Presumed dead was not the same as dead. Years later, when historians reviewed end-of-war disappearances, his case resurfaced briefly because it did not fit the patterns. Most missing officers could be placed within zones of heavy fighting or confirmed retreat routes. His last known location was comparatively quiet. There was no recorded engagement at that time. No airstrike. No ambush. The radio log remained the most haunting detail. 3:17 p.m. Calm, procedural, ordinary. The kind of transmission made by someone who expected to speak again. Those who survived the unit would later recall the moment when they realized he was not coming back. It was not dramatic. It was a slow, creeping understanding that set in as daylight faded and no further orders arrived. Men looked at one another, waiting for leadership that never came. Eventually, someone else took command. They moved on. Survival demanded it. But the question lingered, unspoken yet heavy. Where does an officer go in the middle of a collapsing war without telling anyone? As the years passed, the war ended, borders shifted, forests reclaimed scars in the land, paperwork yellowed, memories dulled, the world moved forward. Yet that single moment remained fixed in time, preserved by ink and habit, a final acknowledgement sent into a system already failing, an unanswered transmission that marked the beginning of a mystery no one could explain. And long after the guns fell silent, long after the uniform disappeared from the roads, the ground near that forest would keep its secret, waiting, unnoticed, as decades passed overhead. After the surrender, the war did not end cleanly. It dissolved into paperwork. What followed the officer's disappearance was not a dramatic manhunt or an urgent inquiry, but a slow, methodical sorting of records by people already overwhelmed by loss. German clerks, many of them civilians pressed into service, began compiling lists of the missing. Names were compared against hospital logs, casualty rolls, and burial records. His name surfaced again and again, always without resolution. The first assumption was capture. By late April 1945, Allied forces were processing tens of thousands of prisoners each day. Officers, especially, were cataloged carefully. They were separated, interrogated, photographed, and assigned identification numbers. Intelligence officers wanted names, ranks, last postings. Even low-ranking officers generated paperwork that traveled across borders. Investigators searched Allied prisoner of war intake lists from multiple sectors. His name was not there. Variations of spelling were checked, dates adjusted, units cross-referenced. Nothing. British, American, and later French records showed no trace of him. There was no alias that matched his description. No unidentified officer fitting his age or rank. Next came battlefield death. This was the most common fate and in many ways the easiest to explain. Bodies were buried hastily or not at all. Identification tags were lost. Graves went unmarked. Entire companies vanished under artillery fire. But battlefield deaths left patterns, locations of heavy fighting, eyewitness accounts, mass graves discovered later. The area where he was last seen did not match those patterns. Military maps showed no major engagement that afternoon, no recorded artillery barrage, no aerial bombing, no ground assault. The sector was in retreat, but it was not under immediate fire. Units moved through it rather than fought over it. Search teams combed the area weeks later when the land was accessible again. They found abandoned equipment, discarded uniforms, broken radios. They did not find him. Desertion was considered next. It was an uncomfortable possibility, but one investigators had to acknowledge. In the final months of the war, desertions increased. Some officers abandoned their posts, removed insignia, and tried to disappear among civilians. Others attempted to flee toward neutral borders. But desertion required preparation. Civilian clothing, false papers, a destination. There was no evidence he had any of those. His personal belongings were still at the command post. His boots were worn thin, unsuitable for long travel. Witnesses did not report him changing clothes or attempting to hide his rank. And most importantly, desertion almost always left witnesses. Someone saw a man walking down a road, slipping into a village, asking for directions. No such sightings were ever reported. As investigators narrowed the possibilities, one detail began to surface repeatedly in survivor statements. Several men recalled seeing him shortly before sunset on the day he vanished. He was not running. He was not under fire. He was walking alone, away from the command post, toward the tree line at the edge of the forest. None of them thought it was unusual at the time. Officers walked away from command posts all the time, checking positions, surveying routes, clearing their heads. The forest had been used as cover for weeks. Supply caches had been hidden there. Temporary shelters had been constructed and abandoned as the front shifted. But when those accounts were reviewed together, a pattern emerged. He was seen heading in the same direction, at roughly the same time, by men who had no reason to coordinate their memories. No one saw him return. The forest was searched again, this time more thoroughly. Patrols moved in lines, spacing themselves carefully, scanning the ground. They found nothing. No disturbed earth, no blood, no discarded gear. It was as if he had crossed an invisible boundary and ceased to exist. As weeks turned into months, attention shifted elsewhere. Europe was starving, cities were rubble, millions were displaced. Investigators were reassigned to war crimes, reconstruction, and denazification. A missing officer, one among countless unresolved cases, was no longer a priority. The file remained open, but inactive. For his family, the waiting became its own form of punishment. Letters were written and unanswered. Offices were visited only to be told. Records were incomplete or lost. Every rumor of surviving officers brought renewed hope, followed by disappointment. They were never given a body to mourn, never given certainty, just a phrase that grew colder with time, missing in action. Years later, when Germany began rebuilding its archives, his file was revisited briefly. Clerks noted the lack of resolution and stamped it accordingly. The folder was boxed, labeled, and stored. Over time, it was moved again and again, between basements, storage rooms, and government facilities. each transfer increasing the distance between the present and the moment he disappeared. To historians, the case became a statistical outlier. Most disappearances could be categorized. His resisted classification. There was no evidence of capture, no evidence of death, no evidence of escape. The absence itself became the defining feature. By the 1960s, interest faded entirely. Witnesses aged, memories blurred. Some of the men who had last seen him died without ever being questioned again. The forest changed, trees grew, paths vanished. What had once been a place of movement and fear became quiet, ordinary land. Officially, the case was never solved. Unofficially, it was forgotten. But the mystery did not end with forgetting. It hardened. Because wars erase many things, but they rarely erase everything. Somewhere there should have been something, a scrap of fabric, a bone, a document, a confession. Instead, there was only a gap where a man should have been. A disappearance that followed none of the rules. A vanishing that should have left a body, but did not. And beneath layers of time and soil, beneath a forest that kept growing undisturbed, something remained hidden, waiting for a future that did not yet know what questions to ask. For a long time, nothing new emerged. The file stayed closed, the forest stayed quiet, and the disappearance remained a curiosity discussed only in footnotes. Then, slowly, indirectly, the story began to surface again, not through documents but through people. It started with rumors. They did not appear in newspapers or official reports. They moved the way rumors always do, passed quietly in villages that had survived the war by keeping their heads down. Farmers spoke of areas of forest they were warned not to enter as children. Hunters mentioned paths that abruptly ended at concrete walls swallowed by moss. Older residents recalled military restrictions that lingered long after the fighting had stopped, enforced at first by Allied patrols and later simply by habit. At first, no one connected these stories to a missing officer. They were just remnants of occupation, fragments of memory shaped by fear and time. But when historians began interviewing locals decades later, a pattern emerged that was difficult to ignore. Several villages near the officer's last known position shared similar accounts. People spoke of sealed entrances, steel doors welded shut, ventilation pipes protruding from hillsides, unnatural clearings where snow melted faster in winter. Some claimed that lights had been seen in the forest at night years after the surrender. Others said they heard machinery underground, a low hum that stopped abruptly whenever someone approached. These accounts were inconsistent in detail but consistent in tone. No one spoke with certainty. Everyone spoke cautiously. For years after the war, there had been a fear of saying the wrong thing. German civilians worried about punishment. Later, during the Cold War, they worried again, this time about being associated with hidden Nazi remnants or espionage. Silence became a habit passed down through generations. The idea that German officers might have avoided capture by disappearing underground was not new. During the war, the Reich invested heavily in subterranean construction. Bunkers, tunnels, command centers, and storage facilities were built across Europe, some documented, others deliberately unrecorded. These were not panic projects of a collapsing regime alone. Many had been planned years earlier, designed to withstand bombardment and isolation. What was unclear was whether such infrastructure could support long-term survival after defeat. Cold War intelligence files added another layer to the mystery. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Allied agencies quietly tracked rumors of former German officers resurfacing under assumed identities. Some reports suggested escape networks that funneled men into remote areas rather than across borders. Others hinted at abandoned installations that might still be occupied. Most of these files were inconclusive. Intelligence agencies were overwhelmed, chasing ghosts across a divided Europe. Still, one recurring detail stood out: references to officers who were never captured, never confirmed dead, and never found. Historians began revisiting wartime engineering doctrine to see if survival underground was even plausible. German military planners had anticipated retreat scenarios long before 1945. Manuals outlined procedures for fallback positions, concealed depots, and temporary command posts designed to operate independently if cut off. Terrain analysis became central to the investigation. The region near the officer's disappearance was ideal for concealment. Dense forests, rocky subsoil suitable for tunneling, limited civilian traffic, natural drainage that could hide ventilation systems. Even modern satellite imagery revealed subtle anomalies, unnatural lines in the landscape, depressions that did not match erosion patterns. None of this proved anything on its own, but together, it challenged the assumption that disappearance without a trace meant death. Skeptics pushed back hard. They argued that post-war rumors were unreliable, shaped by decades of speculation. That supposed tunnels were often nothing more than old cellars or natural caves. That stories of lights and sounds were folklore, not evidence. They also questioned the psychology of survival. Why would an officer choose to live underground rather than surrender? What would sustain him? Food would run out. Isolation would break the mind. The war was over. What purpose would survival serve? Supporters of the theory offered quieter answers. Some officers feared retribution. Others believed the war was not truly over, only paused. Propaganda had conditioned them to expect eventual resurgence or rescue. And some, faced with the collapse of everything they believed in, simply could not imagine life beyond it. Maps were layered over maps. Wartime aerial photographs were compared to modern terrain scans. Engineers studied soil composition and rock stability. They calculated airflow requirements, water access, waste disposal. Nothing they found ruled it out. In fact, the deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the conclusion became. Survival underground was difficult but not impossible. Still, no bunker was found, no entrance confirmed. No document explicitly tied the officer to such a structure. The theory remained just that, a theory. But it changed the way the disappearance was viewed. What had once been seen as a closed case of wartime chaos now felt unfinished. The absence of evidence no longer meant absence of action. It suggested concealment, intention, planning. The forest, long assumed to be just another silent witness to war, began to feel like something else entirely. Not a place of loss, but a place of hiding. And as historians followed the threads, rumors, maps, intelligence files, they found themselves circling the same question again and again. If the officer did not die that day, and if he was not captured, then where did he go? The answer, whatever it was, did not lie in records or testimony alone. It lay somewhere beneath the ground that had refused to give anything up for 80 years, waiting for someone to look not backward but down. The discovery did not begin with history. It began with routine. In the early 2020s, a regional planning office commissioned a standard land stability survey ahead of a proposed forestry access project. The hillside in question had been untouched for decades, covered in dense growth and considered geologically unremarkable. There was no expectation of anything unusual. The survey was meant to confirm slope integrity and identify erosion risks, nothing more. The first anomaly appeared as a shadow on a screen. Ground-penetrating radar returned a series of voids beneath the soil, clean-edged, symmetrical, and too evenly spaced to be natural. At first, technicians assumed an equipment error. Calibration was checked. The scan was repeated from multiple angles. The shapes remained. They were not random cavities. They formed lines, right angles, chambers. Natural caves did not look like this. The finding was flagged and forwarded to regional authorities, who responded cautiously. The area had a complicated history. Unexploded ordnance from the Second World War still surfaced occasionally across Europe, and abandoned Cold War infrastructure was not unheard of. Before any excavation could begin, the site was sealed off and assessed for risk. Specialists were brought in, soil composition was analyzed, archival maps were reviewed to check for known installations. None were listed. The hillside did not appear on any official military plans from either war. No bunkers, no depots, no tunnels. That absence raised more concern than comfort. If the structures were real, and the scans strongly suggested they were, then they had either been deliberately omitted from records or constructed without formal documentation. Both possibilities carried implications that demanded careful handling. Permits were requested. Environmental impact assessments were conducted. Local officials notified national heritage authorities, unsure whether they were dealing with a safety hazard, a historical site, or both. The process moved slowly, governed by protocols designed to avoid irreversible mistakes. When exploratory drilling finally began, it was done cautiously. Small boreholes were sunk at precise locations identified by radar. Air pressure readings changed. A faint draft was detected, moving upward through soil that should have been compact and still. There was space beneath the ground. The first camera lowered into the borehole showed darkness, then concrete. Not cracked, not collapsed, intact. As more boreholes were drilled, the picture became clearer. Reinforced concrete walls, a ceiling supported by steel beams. The geometry suggested purpose, not improvisation. This was not a natural formation or a temporary shelter. It was engineered. At this stage, authorities assumed it was a forgotten military installation, possibly related to post-war Cold War defense. That theory made the most sense on paper. Many such structures had been built hastily and later abandoned, their locations lost as governments changed and records were purged. But as the investigation expanded, cracks appeared in that explanation. Cold War installations followed certain standards. They were larger, designed for vehicles or equipment, often connected to known networks. This structure did not match those profiles. Its footprint was compact. Its access points appeared deliberately concealed. Ventilation shafts were narrow and irregularly spaced, designed to blend into the landscape rather than serve long-term industrial use. More troubling was its depth. The bunker sat deeper than most Cold War facilities, embedded into the hillside in a way that suggested concealment from aerial reconnaissance. That level of precaution pointed backward in time, not forward. Archivists were brought in to cross-check wartime records again, this time with a specific location in mind. Maps were overlaid digitally, old reconnaissance photos scanned and aligned with modern satellite imagery. Slowly, an alignment emerged that no one had anticipated. The hillside lay within walking distance of the vanished officer's last confirmed position. Not nearby, not adjacent. Directly along the route witnesses had described decades earlier, the same forest edge, the same slope, the same direction he had been seen walking toward alone. The realization did not come all at once. It settled gradually, like pressure. Investigators resisted the connection at first. Coincidence was far more comfortable than implication. Europe was full of bunkers. Forests hid countless secrets. Drawing a line between one missing officer and one hidden structure risked overreach. But the more they looked, the harder it became to separate the two. The orientation of the bunker matched wartime defensive logic. Its position offered natural drainage, cover, and concealment. Nearby rock formations would have masked excavation noise. Supply routes could have been accessed discreetly during the war's final weeks, when movement was chaotic and oversight minimal. Every detail that emerged made the structure feel less anonymous. Excavation plans were revised. The site was reclassified from a possible hazard to a protected historical location. Archaeologists joined the team, alongside forensic specialists. Each step was documented. Nothing was rushed. When the first sealed entrance was exposed, it was not dramatic. There was no explosion of revelation, just a steel door, heavily corroded, welded shut from the outside and reinforced from within. Moss and soil had hidden it so completely that it had become part of the hillside. The decision to open it was not taken lightly. Structural engineers assessed the risk of collapse. Air samples were tested for toxins. Emergency teams stood by. The door was breached incrementally, a narrow opening cut to allow inspection before full entry. Behind it, darkness stretched inward. The air that escaped was stale but breathable. No signs of fire damage. No immediate evidence of collapse. The bunker had held. Inside, the walls were bare concrete. Narrow corridors extended beyond the range of the first lights. There were no markings indicating modern military use. No serial numbers. No signage. Nothing that tied it to any known Cold War project. It felt older. As investigators prepared to move deeper, a sense of unease settled over the site. This was no longer just a structural anomaly. It was a place someone had meant to disappear into. And as archival researchers continued cross-checking dates, units, and movement logs, one fact became impossible to ignore. The bunker's construction timeline, based on materials and technique, pointed squarely to the final years of the Second World War, which meant that whatever lay inside had been sealed away at the exact moment. One officer vanished without explanation. The ground had refused to settle for decades, holding its shape, preserving its secret. And now, as the first steps were taken inside, it was clear that this was not a forgotten installation. It was a destination. And for the first time in 80 years, the disappearance no longer felt abstract. It felt close, personal, as if the forest had been waiting for someone to finally open the door it had guarded in silence, one that might lead, at last, to the answer of where the officer went when he walked away and never returned. Once the initial breach was made, the pace of the investigation slowed even further. Nothing about the space encouraged haste. The bunker had survived 8 decades underground without collapse, and any misstep could change that. Engineers insisted on incremental entry, mapping each meter before moving forward. Every measurement, every material sample, every air reading was logged and time-stamped. What struck investigators almost immediately was how deliberate the construction felt. This was not a hastily dug shelter carved out during a last-minute retreat. The concrete was poured evenly. Reinforcement bars were placed with care. Corners were clean, not jagged. Whoever built this had time, planning, and skilled labor. That detail alone complicated the narrative. By late April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Resources were scarce. Manpower was stretched thin. Building something like this would have required authorization, secrecy, and foresight, none of which fit neatly with the image of a disintegrating front. And yet, here it was. As corridors were measured and sketched, the internal layout began to emerge. The bunker was not large, but it was efficient. A central passage branched into several smaller chambers, each serving a distinct purpose. One room showed signs of having housed electrical equipment. Another appeared designed for storage. A third, narrower and more isolated, suggested sleeping quarters. There were no modern fixtures, no plastic, no wiring consistent with post-war construction. Everything pointed to mid-20th century methods. Insulation materials matched those used during the later years of the war. Ventilation shafts were narrow and cleverly angled, designed to disperse exhaust air in a way that would be nearly invisible from above. This was concealment taken seriously. As teams moved deeper, they began to find subtle traces of human presence. Not artifacts yet, just wear. Scuff marks on the concrete floor, a smoothness along one wall where a hand might have brushed past repeatedly. These were not things radar could detect. They were impressions left by routine. At the same time, archival researchers working off-site intensified their efforts. Now that the bunker's location was confirmed, records were revisited with renewed focus. Wartime engineering units operating in the region were identified. Their construction schedules were reviewed. One unit, active in early 1945, specialized in subterranean command posts designed to be erased from official maps. The unit's logs were incomplete. Several pages were missing. The entry stopped abruptly in March. No follow-up reports, no confirmation of demolition. That gap had gone unnoticed for decades. Only now, with a physical structure in the ground, did it begin to matter. Local testimony was re-examined as well. Villagers who had once spoken cautiously were approached again, this time with context. Some admitted they had always known something was there. Others recalled being told as children never to dig in certain areas, never to light fires near the hillside, never to ask questions. One elderly man remembered soldiers coming through weeks after the surrender, not Allied troops but Germans out of uniform. They carried supplies. They avoided roads. They disappeared into the forest and did not return. At the time, he assumed they were deserters hiding out. He never imagined they were going underground. That memory had never been written down. No one had asked before. Back inside the bunker, the investigation reached a threshold. A sealed interior door blocked access to the deepest section. Unlike the exterior entrance, this door had been locked from the inside. Its mechanism was simple but sturdy. No signs of forced entry. No damage. It had been closed intentionally. Before opening it, forensic teams documented everything around it. Dust patterns suggested it had not been opened in decades. Airflow readings showed no circulation beyond it. Whatever lay behind that door had been isolated completely from the rest of the structure. The decision to proceed came after days of discussion. There were safety concerns, but there was also an awareness that this door represented the boundary between speculation and evidence. Until it was opened, the bunker was just a structure. Beyond it might be answers. When the lock was finally disengaged, it resisted briefly, then gave way with a muted sound that echoed down the corridor. The door swung inward slowly, releasing air that had been sealed off for a generation. The chamber beyond was smaller than expected, more intimate. This was not a command room. It was not designed for groups. It was designed for one person. The walls were lined with shelving. Some shelves were empty. Others held containers whose labels had long since faded. The floor bore marks consistent with a narrow bed or cot having been placed there. Against one wall stood a simple wooden table, its surface scarred by use. This was not a place of temporary shelter. It was a place meant to be lived in. The implications rippled outward immediately. If someone had occupied this space, then the disappearance was not a momentary event. It was a decision, a choice made deliberately, perhaps long before the war officially ended. Investigators paused the excavation at this point. The site was reclassified again, this time as a potential missing persons resolution site. That change brought with it new protocols. Forensic anthropologists were added to the team. Psychological profilers were consulted to help interpret the space not just as architecture, but as behavior. Why choose this location? Why this moment? Why vanish without telling anyone? As more measurements were taken, another detail emerged, one that had gone unnoticed in earlier scans. A narrow auxiliary tunnel branched off from the main chamber, sloping gently downward. It did not appear on the initial radar images, likely masked by surrounding rock. This tunnel led deeper into the hillside, toward an area that had never been disturbed by post-war activity. The discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. Until now, the bunker had answered some questions while raising others, but this tunnel suggested something more, an extension, a contingency, a plan beyond simply hiding. Work was halted again while engineers assessed stability. The tunnel's construction was cruder, narrower, less finished. It looked like something added later, perhaps under pressure, perhaps in haste. That detail mattered, because it suggested a timeline, not just of construction but of occupation, a beginning and possibly an end. Outside, word of the discovery began to spread cautiously among academic circles. No official announcements were made. Authorities understood the sensitivity. This was not just a historical find. It was the potential resolution of a disappearance that had haunted records for 80 years. As night fell over the forest, the hillside looked unchanged. Trees stood where they always had. Birds returned to their nests. From the surface, nothing hinted at the space beneath. But underground, lights now illuminated concrete walls that had last seen human presence in another era. And with each step deeper into the bunker, the question that had lingered since 3:17 p.m. in April 1945 grew sharper. If this was where the officer went, then the war had not ended for him when it ended for everyone else. It had simply moved underground. And whatever truth lay at the end of that tunnel was no longer buried by time alone. It was waiting, just out of reach, for the next door to open. The first glimpse inside the bunker was unremarkable, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of 80 years of unanswered questions. Investigators lowered cameras and lights through the breached exterior door, and the footage that came back showed concrete walls, narrow corridors, and a space that had been kept surprisingly clean. No debris littered the floors. No signs of forced entry beyond the exterior seal. Every measurement, every corner, every surface was documented before anyone stepped inside. Forensic teams moved slowly, knowing that even the smallest misstep could destroy evidence that had survived nearly a century. Once full access was gained, the interior revealed its meticulous design. The bunker was compact but functional, organized in a way that suggested planning for long-term habitation. There was a central corridor running the length of the structure, branching off into smaller chambers. One room appeared designed for sleeping. A narrow cot frame remained, its springs partially intact, and dust patterns hinted at repeated use over time. Another contained shelving that still held cans of rations, some of which bore dates well after the war had ended. The tins were marked in German, stamped 1946 and 1947, evidence that someone had lived in this space long beyond April 1945. On a simple wooden table, forensic teams found handwritten logs, remarkably preserved despite the humid underground environment. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting was legible, formal, methodical, the same careful script that had marked his wartime orders and personal notes. Researchers cross-referenced the logs with known military serial numbers, and for the first time, the missing officer's identity was confirmed. Each record matched his rank, name, and unit. Every precaution he had taken to conceal his presence had not prevented modern investigation from reconstructing the truth, but it had kept him hidden for decades. The logs themselves were dry yet hauntingly human. They recorded routine events, inventory checks, and careful notes about supplies and weather, almost as if the officer had imposed military discipline on solitude itself. Days were marked meticulously, sometimes with nothing more than notation of temperature or water level in a nearby cistern. But interspersed among these entries were hints of the psychological toll of living underground. Frustration with leaky pipes, anxiety over dwindling rations, notes about dreams, and moments of despair recorded in terse, unadorned sentences. Forensic analysis of materials deepened the understanding of how survival was possible. The ration tins indicated a carefully maintained supply chain. Engineers determined that food had been stored strategically, with rotation to prevent spoilage. Water had been collected from a small underground spring, filtered through improvised systems using sand and charcoal. Ventilation shafts, previously noted as unusual, were calculated to provide sufficient airflow for one person, though not comfortably for an extended period. Lighting came from oil lamps and early battery-powered lamps, whose batteries had been replaced over the years with scavenged components found in forgotten equipment caches. Every detail suggested a life lived entirely below ground, self-sufficient, isolated, and meticulous. What became clear during excavation was the psychological landscape of this isolation. The officer had chosen disappearance deliberately. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, no panic-driven entry. He had not been forced underground by circumstance alone. Logs and the arrangement of living space suggested careful preparation, almost ritualized, as though he had created a microcosm of the military order he had left behind on the surface. He measured time in entries, not clocks. He maintained supplies with military precision. He marked boundaries, mapped the space, and even documented airflow and water levels as if reporting to an unseen superior. The bunker's architecture itself facilitated this self-imposed exile. Narrow corridors limited movement, reinforcing solitude. Walls were thick, absorbing sound, preventing eavesdropping and providing protection from environmental change. The ventilation system, though small, ensured a steady supply of air. Access to the hillside above was impossible without breaking the external seal, effectively locking him inside. Every aspect of the design reinforced isolation. The officer had created a world with all the basic requirements for survival, but removed from human contact entirely. Small personal effects amplified the human story. A leather-bound notebook contained sketches of landscapes he remembered from before the retreat, as if he was marking the world outside in memory because he could not experience it directly. A pair of reading glasses, worn and scratched, lay atop folded uniforms. Maps of the region, annotated in his hand, were stacked neatly, some with notations of potential escape routes or observation points, suggesting he had considered leaving but chose not to. These items conveyed a man rooted in discipline, yet profoundly aware of the psychological consequences of his choice. The tension between safety and solitude, and the innate need for connection. Investigators also noted the meticulous sanitation practices he maintained. Waste disposal systems were carefully designed, using rudimentary but effective filtration and drainage. Hygiene was maintained to the extent possible in a confined space. Every corner showed signs of wear consistent with repeated cleaning. This level of organization hinted at a deliberate attempt to sustain not just life, but some semblance of normalcy, a disciplined, ordered existence in defiance of the total collapse occurring outside the forest decades earlier. The living space also revealed his decision-making about risk. Supplies had been cached in areas deep within the bunker, presumably to reduce exposure during the process of storage. The ventilation and drainage systems were concealed from casual detection, suggesting awareness of potential discovery. His choice to remain underground was not a surrender to circumstance but a considered plan. He had assessed the outside world, weighed his options, and deliberately created a refuge insulated from both enemy forces and civilian discovery. Throughout the investigation, forensic anthropologists documented the physical evidence while historians tried to contextualize it. The combination of concrete walls, dated rations, and handwritten logs painted a detailed picture. The officer survived for years beyond the collapse of Nazi Germany, living entirely in isolation, dependent on his planning and discipline. His choice to disappear was as much about control and self-preservation as about evading capture. He had rejected surrender not in a moment of defiance, but through decades of calculated self-imposed exile. Every step taken in the bunker seemed to reconstruct a day in his life. He would wake, check supplies, record weather and air quality, maintain the ventilation shafts, eat rations, and write in his logs. He measured time meticulously, though not in hours but in entries and routines. Sleep, exercise, and hygiene followed schedules he had imposed himself. The space became his world, and he became dependent on its strict order for both survival and sanity. Isolation reshaped him psychologically. His notes revealed subtle changes in tone over the years, shifts from formal precision to brief, terse annotations, hinting at frustration or weariness. Moments of self-reflection occasionally surfaced, suggesting an awareness of the impossibility of life outside these walls and the permanence of his choice. He had survived, but not without paying a psychological cost. The bunker offered safety, yet it demanded solitude as the price. By the time investigators had fully documented the interior, the narrative of his disappearance had shifted. It was no longer just a question of where he went. The focus moved to why he stayed. Why, when freedom and surrender were possible, had he chosen to remain underground, isolated from the world entirely? Every ration, every log, every personal object spoke to that decision, revealing a man whose discipline, fear, and foresight combined to create a private world separate from history. The bunker narrowed the mystery from absence to intent. It explained the untraceable disappearance that had puzzled historians and family alike. It answered the question of survival, confirming that he had not died in the forest or been captured. But it also posed a deeper, more haunting question. Why abandon everything, including life among others, to live in silence for years? The evidence left no room for speculation about his presence. It documented it, but the human reasoning behind it remained as mysterious as the day he vanished. Inside the concrete walls, the missing officer's story was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible. It was measured, cataloged, and dated. Every careful action he had taken to maintain life and order now provided a window into a man who had lived alone, beneath the forest, for decades after the war had ended, surviving physically through planning and psychologically through discipline, but isolated entirely from the world he once knew. And with that realization, the investigation stood at a threshold. The location, the materials, the logs, and the personal effects had answered the where and how. Now it was time to confront the why fully, and that question would take investigators even deeper into the psychology, choices, and final fate of the man who had walked away at 3:17 p.m. in 1945 and never returned. Decades of silence ended not with revelation in the archives, but with the slow, deliberate uncovering of the bunker. For 80 years, the forest had swallowed the truth, leaving the officer's disappearance to drift through rumor, conjecture, and bureaucratic oversight. Now, after painstaking documentation, forensic analysis, and cross-referencing of wartime and post-war records, the pieces finally aligned. The story that began at 3:17 p.m. in April 1945 could at last be told in detail, grounded in evidence rather than speculation. The physical evidence inside the bunker allowed investigators to construct a timeline of survival. Ration tins, stamped and rotated, indicated that he had lived underground for at least 3 years beyond the official end of the war. Logs recorded in meticulous handwriting corroborated this, showing sequential entries spanning into the late 1940s. Water sources, filtration methods, and careful maintenance of the ventilation shafts confirmed that he had adapted efficiently to underground life. The structure itself, engineered to blend seamlessly with the hillside, provided both protection and concealment, making discovery virtually impossible without modern surveying equipment. From these details, forensic teams were able to estimate his likely routines. He had established a disciplined schedule, waking, inventorying, and maintaining his supplies, monitoring air and water, recording observations about weather and forest conditions, and taking care of basic hygiene. The structure's design reinforced solitude but enabled survival. Psychological analysis suggested that his adherence to routine was as much a strategy for mental stability as for physical survival. Notes written in the later years reflected an increasingly introspective tone, hinting at awareness of isolation and the passing of time. He had deliberately cut himself off from the world, not as a rash act of desperation, but as a calculated decision. Determining the likely end of his life required careful synthesis of environmental, medical, and material evidence. Food stocks, though rotated and replenished for years, eventually ran low. Logs indicate ration entry slowing and then ceasing, suggesting dwindling provisions or declining health. Dust accumulation and subtle changes in the bunker's condition indicated a final period of inactivity before the structure was sealed completely from further use. Anthropologists examining remnants, including skeletal fragments consistent with age and conditions that could be expected from a prolonged subterranean existence, proposed that he likely survived into the early 1950s, far beyond what contemporaries could have imagined, but eventually succumbed to natural causes rather than violence or accident. The final forensic analysis also confirmed identity unequivocally. Handwriting on logs matched his known military correspondence. Personal effects contained serial numbers traceable to him. Small items like uniform buttons and insignia corresponded to his rank and unit. There was no doubt the missing officer had survived in total isolation for years, deliberately choosing concealment over surrender. The case, once thought insoluble, now rested on a foundation of hard evidence. The emotional weight of these findings was profound. For his family, answers arrived 80 years late. Letters written by descendants, previously unanswered due to lack of information, could now be updated with certainty. The officer had not died in combat. He had not been executed, captured, or abandoned. He had survived the immediate chaos of 1945, only to face an entirely different battle underground, with the forest as both shield and prison. While the closure brought factual clarity, it could not erase the decades of uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions endured by those who had loved him. Historians revisited the broader implications of the discovery. If one officer could disappear in such a deliberate, concealed manner, surviving for years without leaving a trace, how many other wartime vanishings had been misclassified or remained unresolved? The case prompted reassessment of missing person reports, POW records, and post-war administrative anomalies. What had once been considered inexplicable chaos now could be viewed through a lens that included deliberate, methodical survival. The forest, the hills, and hidden bunkers scattered across Europe might hold other stories yet untold. Investigators reconstructed the final moments of the officer's decision to vanish with remarkable clarity. Witness statements, combined with spatial analysis of the forest and the bunker, confirmed that the moment at 3:17 p.m. in April 1945 marked not just his last recorded communication, but the initiation of a carefully planned disappearance. He walked toward the forest edge, as recorded by those who saw him, knowing the terrain and his own contingency plans. The sealed underground structure, constructed with foresight and discipline, awaited him. Once inside, he was hidden from both friend and foe, and the war which had raged across Europe became irrelevant within the concrete walls of his self-imposed refuge. The psychological implications of the bunker's discovery were as compelling as the physical evidence. Isolation had become both protection and punishment. Notes and logs reveal a man maintaining mental discipline through routine, recording observations meticulously, and sustaining a sense of order in an otherwise static environment. Yet there is also a subtle record of the toll taken by solitude. The handwriting grows less precise over time, annotations shorten, and minor errors appear. The officer had created a life with all necessary physical parameters for survival, but it demanded a heavy emotional price. By choosing concealment over surrender, he preserved life while relinquishing the world itself. Closure arrived through modern procedure and rigorous documentation. The bunker was cataloged in full, with all materials preserved for historical record. Photographs, measurements, and recovered logs were entered into national archives. Authorities officially closed the case, designating it resolved with the officer's death confirmed posthumously in the early 1950s. For the first time since 3:17 p.m., the silence surrounding his disappearance had a reason, a location, and a timeline. Scholars, historians, and family members could now reference tangible evidence rather than speculation, bringing an unprecedented degree of certainty to an event once shrouded in mystery. Yet the resolution was not comfortable. Understanding the truth highlighted both human resilience and profound isolation. The officer had survived when others perished, yet he had done so alone. His ingenuity and discipline ensured life, but the psychological cost was extreme. His story reframed the meaning of missing in wartime, illustrating that disappearance could be an act of agency, a deliberate refusal to surrender, and a choice to exist outside the reach of both allies and enemies. Finally, the narrative came full circle. The timeline began with the simple, stark entry in a radio log, 3:17 p.m., April 1945. That moment had once represented a question mark, a silence that left an entire life unaccounted for. Now, after decades of investigation, analysis, and excavation, the silence could be understood. The officer had not vanished into chaos. He had entered concealment deliberately, structured life in isolation, and left a trace so subtle that only modern techniques could uncover it. The forest had preserved his secret, the bunker had protected it, and the world finally acknowledged the truth. As historians, forensic teams, and family members reflected on the findings, the lesson was clear. Disappearances are not always the result of death, misfortune, or capture. Sometimes, they are the product of choice, discipline, and survival instincts honed to an extraordinary degree. The story of the officer, beginning and ending at 3:17 p.m., was no longer a mystery in the traditional sense. The silence had been intentional, the disappearance deliberate, and the legacy, though haunting, resolved. Forest reclaimed its quiet. The bunker remained, a preserved witness to a man's extraordinary decision to live, unseen and alone, long after the world had moved on. The mystery that had haunted records and imagination for 8 decades was no longer unsolved. The question of where he went was answered. The question of why he stayed remained, etched in the logs, the concrete walls, and the haunting realization that one life could be hidden so completely, yet leave such an indelible mark on history.